So the first panel session of day 2 will be addressing the gap of future health. And we are pleased to have Dr. Farhad Riahi with us to chair this session. Dr. Riahi, he is the head of Novartis Healthcare System Group, where he leads Novartis' efforts to become a trusted partner to healthcare systems for improving patients' outcome and system productivity. Prior to joining Novartis, Dr. Riahi was a partner at McKinsey & Company. Dr. Riahi also maintains a part-time clinical practice in Canada, focused on serving Canada's First Nation population. Without further ado, I'll hand over to Dr. Riahi to start the session, Future Health Gap. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Janice. Hello, everyone. So we're going to start today by looking into the future, understanding what are the health problems that the world is going to have so that you can actually solve them. And it's hard to talk about the future, because it's hard to say what exactly is going to happen. Since we are in Cambridge, I thought I would quote one of my favorite Cambridge alumni, Douglas Adams, who wrote The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And this is what he had to say about it. Trying to predict the future is a mug's game. But increasingly, it's a game that we all have to play, because the world is changing so fast, and we need to have some sort of idea of what the future is actually going to look like, because we're going to have to live in it, probably next week. Douglas Adams was pretty scathing about the technology industry and its ability to predict the future. So completely missing the rise of the internet and the implications of that was sort of one of his favorite topics. The good news for you guys is that in healthcare, we've got two big advantages. We can be more confident in our predictions because, to some extent, some of the future has actually already happened. Right? So there are going to be more people on this planet, as Sir David just talked about. The population is going to be older, so we are going to have more diseases of the aging, even if we all stay relatively healthy. And of course, we're not all going to stay relatively healthy. If you look at what people eat, what they drink, what they smoke, how much they don't exercise, we are going to have more chronic diseases. So you're going to have to deal with that. And if you think that it's all going to be chronic disease, that's not going to be true either, because as we get wealthier, we are going to use up more of the ecosystems, we are going to travel more, we are going to make it much easier for the rest of life, and in particular viruses and bacteria, to do interesting things. So don't be surprised to see new infections emerging, don't be surprised to see more epidemics and more pandemics. And the other thing that we can predict as we look at the distribution of wealth and economic growth around the world is that the old sort of dichotomy of diseases of the rich world and diseases of the poor world, or developed or developing, isn't really going to be true either. Even today, if you look at the entire population of the world that has diabetes, already close to a third of them are Chinese. And that's just the start. Right? So some elements of the future, in a sense, have already been seeded today. We know what they're going to be. We can do something about them. The second big advantage we have is that we have real experts on these topics who can tell you something about what is likely to happen and where, therefore, we should be looking at. So I'm going to ask everyone then to take just about 5 minutes, perhaps, to talk about your choice of these topics and where you want to talk about, and focus on 3 questions. First is, what do you think, how do you think these health gaps are going to evolve between now and 2050? The second question is, where should the science focus today to prepare us to deal with these? So what should our audience be doing today scientifically? And the third question is that we're not the only people dealing with these issues. There's entire health systems who are going to have to deal with these things. What do you think is going to happen? How are health systems going to respond? And what are the implications of that for biotechnology solutions that are coming out? So those are 3 questions. I'm delighted that we have 5 great panelists with us today. Professor Sharon Peacock, who's the Deputy Director of the Wellcome Trust, Cambridge Center for Global Health Research. Dr. Annalisa Jenkins, Head of Global R&D at Merck Serono. Dr. Helen Lee, who's Director of Research at the Department of Haematology here in Cambridge. Professor Chris Dobson, who's Master of St. John's College. and Dr. Andrin Oswald, who is head of the division of Novartis Vaccines and Diagnostics. Professor Peacock.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Start us off.
Good morning, everybody. I'm really delighted to be here speaking at this really important session on future health gaps or health threats. And the health gaps suggested by our chair included emerging infectious diseases, and I felt that I was qualified to talk about that. So I'm really going to be talking about two things to you to really set the foundation knowledge for you to be able to debate issues around this, and that is pandemics and antimicrobial resistant bacteria. Now, I will tackle the specific issues that our chair has raised for each of these, which includes how they might evolve between now and 2050, what challenges they'll present to us, and then where science should shine a light today to solve these problems by 2050. Now, I think that I would start by echoing what our chair's already said, and that is that these issues affect rich and poor. It doesn't matter where you live. It doesn't matter actually if you're middle class or not. It will affect you. And an important starting point for both is that both pandemics and antimicrobial resistance share a common underlying mechanism grounded in evolution and positive selection. Now, that means they're unpredictable and out of our control. There are also several differences between the two which deserve some more discussion to better understand what challenges they might present. And so I'll start with pandemics. Now, how are these going to evolve between now and 2050? Well, a pandemic is an epidemic occurring on a scale that crosses international boundaries and usually affects a large number of people. Notable pandemics have included typhoid fever, plague. There's a range of different pathogens, but something that really we're beginning to see in the last 100 years or so is that pandemics occur when new pathogens are created through evolution. For example, the flu. Recombination of different parts of flu viruses in different animals lead to the emergence of a new pathogen. So with the Spanish flu in 1918, it killed 3 to 5% of the world population. And so the uncomfortable truth is that the emergence of a new pathogen is very difficult to predict. You don't know where it's going to happen, and you don't know what it's going to look like. So what challenge would a new pandemic actually present? Well, this really boils down to the virulence of the pathogen and how many people become sick or die as a result. We've seen several putative or potential pandemics recently where we've seen the virulence actually vary of the different pathogens. So what will this depend on? Well, first of all, it will depend on whether people who are exposed have immunity to an existing pathogen which protects them from the new pathogen. So a well-known example of this is immunity against smallpox amongst dairymaids exposed to cowpox. Virulence is also dictated by the ability to spread from human to human. That is actually a key part of its virulence. And in addition, how serious is it going to, how serious is the illness that occurs? For example, a cold causes a sniffle, which doesn't make us feel particularly unwell, but Ebola virus is intrinsically more deadly and kills most of those affected. So to summarise, the challenge of a new pandemic will actually depend on where it emerges, how quickly it spreads, and how lethal it is. So far I've described a lot of actually uncertainty rather than certainty. So let's just turn to science and consider how this could actually help us with pandemics. Now, we have to assume, because of the nature of pandemics, that science will be reactive rather than proactive or preventative. So something will happen, and the key thing is to spot it rapidly, diagnose a new syndrome, identify the cause, and identify the source, where is this coming from. And this information can be used to prevent further spread, to develop diagnostic tests, and define what treatments might be effective. Now, there are several technologies that could make a difference here, which you might want to consider. I think one of them is an incredible pace in the development around communications and connectedness. Now, pandemics spread around the world, and having a real-time tracking system could be really useful in understanding its spread. Science around diagnostic could be very useful to develop a sensitive and specific rapid bedside test that could be used in the field in the developed and the developing world. And Helen will no doubt be telling us something about that. That's the common model right now for access to technology innovation in the developing world. It tends to get developed in developed world and to transfer over to the developing world. So more complex technologies could be used, such as pathogen genome sequencing. And this gives us information about the origin of the new pathogen, the potential source, the likely transmissibility, and its drug resistance. And sequencing technologies are actually going to become ubiquitous in clinical care by 2050. The question is whether these advances in genome sequencing can be deployed in the developing world. And I think that's a very important question, not just for infectious diseases, but for other conditions too. So thinking about blue sky science, it would be transformational to have a rapid drug discovery pipeline that developed and manufactured a drug within days or weeks. And the same is true for vaccines. Now, turning briefly to my second topic, which is antimicrobial resistance. How is this going to evolve between now and 2050? Well, the best word to describe this, unfortunately, is inexorable. With some notable exceptions, pathogenic bacteria become increasingly resistant over time. And this is because antibiotics select for resistance, and the use of antibiotics, the levels are very high, and in many places around the world, uncontrolled. Now, this is an interesting issue because we heard earlier that middle classes consume. Actually, middle classes are least likely to take antibiotics when they go to the GP because they're not allowed to take them. Actually, the use of antibiotics is uncontrolled, much in the developing world, because they're accessible, people don't have sufficient money to get good consultation, and if they can spend $1 on healthcare, they'll spend it on an antibiotic rather than a consultation. So the most likely pattern between now and 2050 is that we'll continue to see an upward trend in resistance in most pathogenic bacteria. And what we'll have on the back of that is punctuation by the emergence of and rapid spread of resistance of a very special clinical significance. For example, at the moment, there's a current upsurge in the UK and the world in gram-negative bacteria that are resistant to one of our big gun antibiotics, the carbapenem group. So the challenges that resistance will present to the world is really obvious in some respects. People with previously treatable conditions will no longer be able to be treated because they have no effective drugs, or else their outcome is poor because a second or third line choice drug is not as effective. But actually, something that's much less obvious is in other areas of care. So if you have an elective surgery, for example, you have a joint replacement or abdominal surgery, you have a dose of antibiotics when you're on the table to avoid post-operative infection. If there are no antibiotics, routine surgery becomes very high risk indeed. It's actually almost impossible to give treatments that suppress the immune system to treat cancer or transplantation, because those individuals very commonly become seriously ill with bacterial infection, and that needs potent antibiotics. So cancer treatment becomes impossible. So antimicrobial resistance is very serious. So where should science focus? Well, there's no one answer, since there are numerous knowledge gaps, unfortunately. Undoubtedly, the biggest problem is the investment, research and development into new antibiotics, which is completely stalled. So this is one of the key areas where technology could focus. But there are other strategies that are more low-tech, such as defining the benefits of giving combinations of existing drugs, repurposing drugs that are marketed for one thing could be used for another, understanding antibiotic use in livestock and what effect that has on the overall antimicrobial resistance, and so on. But actually, perhaps the most important thing we should be thinking about is not biotechnology, but education and social change. It's changing our pattern around taking antibiotics and expecting antibiotics when we go and see a doctor that will make the big difference. So the driver for change is social and not biotechnological. And so I think my closing comments relate to the relative importance of infectious diseases, which I think is important, compared to non-infectious diseases. I think there'll be a major shift in the importance of non-infectious diseases, and at the moment, infectious diseases and parasitic diseases are actually strongly prioritised in the research community. But I believe that actually has to change. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to hearing the other speakers and discussing these matters.
Thank you, Professor Peacock.
So I'm going to stand up today. Speaker working? Yeah. Hi, good morning. It's nice to see you again. If you remember, I'm the day one of my unplugged, can say what I like. No longer an employee of Merck Serono, ex-head of R&D, Merck Serono. Somebody asked me today, how did I want to be referred to? I said, well, you know, being an ex sounds quite distinguished, I think. But anyway, let me try and offer a few perspectives on, from an industry point of view. I mean, obviously, I have perspectives that I'd like to share sort of more on the global public health side. But from an industry point of view, one thing I want, the first point that I really would like to offer you is this notion of 50 years, and to put it into perspective. If you think about our industry, and if you wind back 50 years from today, 1964, you might sort of reflect on the fact that that was really the first phase of really the acceleration of innovation in pharmaceutical drug development based on largely small molecule technologies and a basic understanding of biology of disease. And a lot of basic science in the 60s and 70s coming out of the US, labs in the UK, Japan, really led to that first wave of innovation, because what happened was the IP and the inventions of the 60s, 70s, and 80s turned into the blockbuster 90s for our industry. We were swimming in a sea of money. You know, we had antihypertensives, we had the statins, the antidepressants. You know, those were really the glory days of our industry in the 90s. I call that really the first phase of our industry. And then as we got to the end of the 90s, what happened was we came to this notion that, you know, healthcare systems really potentially just couldn't cope with this inexorable rise in costs. Companies got a little bit lazy, I would have to say, as they were swimming in blockbusters and billion-dollar revenues. And we entered a whole new phase of the industry in two ways, both at the scientific level and also on the commercial level. And it became very clear that we were in an era of what I call the Me Too Lates, which was that this notion that you could bring your 7th or 10th or 15th ACE inhibitor to market and still expect to make a lot of money on it was really going away, because healthcare systems were starting to introduce, you know, ways of limiting access or debating the value of our medicines and really having important discussions about price. And in those days also, I think that there was this, at the end of the 90s, the genome, you had the whole genome sort of promise, and people were really starting to switch their thinking into new ways of looking at, you know, basic biology and understanding the molecular basis of disease. And we entered a new period about 10 to 12 years ago. And we've been living in that new period, which has been really an acceleration, I think, in many aspects of what we do in the industry. And remember, in the industry, we all do the same thing. It's not as if there's some magical sort of model that one company is pursuing that's differentiated from another. We all essentially discover, develop, make, and market pharmaceuticals, medicines. But what has happened is the areas of focus that we're working in. I joined the industry at a time where the big hot place to be was in cardiovascular medicine and diabetes, and there was a lot of work going on in infectious diseases and vaccines. Today, what we find is a couple of major shifts in where companies are really focusing, and I do think that that's what we're going to see, certainly, in the next 20 to 30 years. And I do think that the next 50 years offers us about 1.5 to 2 cycles of innovation. Yeah, because remember, what we do takes an awfully long time. If you think about when the first really early work that was going on antibodies, I think you talked about that yesterday, it was about 20 to 30 years ago. If you think about a lot of the work we're doing today, it's based on the research of many distinguished academics in their labs in the 60s and 70s. So I think that, you know, for you guys, as you sit here today in your mid to late 20s, and if you think about what your life's work is going to look like, I predict you're going to be working on a number of really exciting areas. And what gets me excited at the moment is a couple of things. Harnessing the body's immune system to fight cancer. I would suggest we're really at the beginning of that acceleration phase in the new opportunities that presents for patients living with cancer. And why is it important? Well, in about 2020 to 2025, 2/3 of the deaths from cancer will actually come from low and middle income countries. We just heard about the diabetes issue in China. So cancer is a disease that impacts the world. And today, with our increased understanding of cancer, and certainly the opportunities that we have to understand far more the molecular basis and the cellular signaling pathways and the way the body deals with cancer, and there's an enormous opportunity still present. There's only 1 or 2 medicines, and I worked on the first real medicine which harnesses the immune system to fight cancer, called ipilimumab, which is transforming the lives of patients living with metastatic melanoma. If you think about that, there is really a huge pathway ahead of us to really unlock the basic science, to evolve the basic science, to develop new therapeutics. Moving on from that also is the opposite, which is the way that the body has an unchecked immune system and that diseases like lupus develop. And lupus is a fascinating disease. We really, really still don't understand the fundamental basic biology of lupus. I've been working on lupus for about 10 years now. We have 1 drug on the market and it's not very good. And so there's an enormous opportunity. And why, again, is lupus so important and diseases of the immune system? Because this is where we start to talk about the economic impact of disease. And we're all very familiar with that in the lower middle income countries. But let's not forget developed countries. These diseases strike people in their prime, working age, young people, multiple sclerosis, lupus. There's a whole swathe of these autoimmune diseases. I'm always struck when I'm sitting in the scientific discussions about how little we still know. Now, we take shots in the dark and we produce therapeutics that we think are going to work. Enormous opportunities in this space. Another area that I'm really interested in is in heart failure, cardiologist. I think that, we've made huge progress in management of patients at high risk from heart attack and stroke. We have many, many drugs that are available now to help manage patients with diabetes. And there are different issues now facing patients who are living at high risk of cardiovascular disease, and that's more in the public health arena, systems of healthcare. Today, patients with heart failure often have a prognosis that's worse than patients living with cancer. The 5-year mortality rates are just huge. And yet we have a very limited armamentarium to help deal with these patients. And so again, I do believe that there's going to be a huge new investment and a wave of investment in this space. So that's an awfully interesting area. And of course, another area that Professor Dobson is going to talk about, which many of us have been working on for many years, is the brain, the human brain, and the notion of degenerative brain disorders, and really trying to continue to unlock the basic biology again and then translating that into therapeutic discoveries. And, we call this the sort of graveyard of drug development, this area, for good reason. I do, though, see that as basic science is starting to really evolve, we are starting to see an ability and a willingness of the industry to get back into this space and to tread carefully, but to get back into this space. So those are the areas that I'm very excited about. Of course, infectious diseases, I think, will evolve with a slightly different model. I do believe that the basic business model of the pharmaceutical industry will not change in the next 50 years. But what we are starting to see is this new ecosystem of different parts of the system, public-private partnerships, biotech, large pharma, academia, all playing their role to really, with a shared purpose, think about how to pursue and invest in this model moving forward. The other trend that we're seeing a lot of is the globalization of the industry. When I joined the industry, the idea was you produced a drug for the US population or perhaps the European population, then you exported it. Today, at the tables of our industry, and certainly in the companies I've worked for, you are seeing a dialogue that is far more global and broad-ranging, really looking to address the unmet medical needs of patients on a global basis. There's no doubt, of course, that the developed world will continue to have the resources. We can debate how many resources and how they're going to spend those resources to pursue these new opportunities, but it's absolutely clear that the current generation in R&D in our industry care just as much about addressing the diseases and the health needs of the broader global populations, and that's a good thing. And last but not least, as you pursue your careers, I would have a piece of advice for you, which is learn about IT, technology, big data, and pay attention in your statistics classes. because I have to tell you that big data, real-world research, the ability to really think in a more sort of Bayesian way, and I'm a huge fan of this sort of way of thinking, I think is one of the biggest trends we're seeing, certainly in the R&D laboratories of our industry, and a whole new way of thinking about how to take population data and to gather insights and then start to pursue hypotheses around that. You're going to see a fundamentally different way, I believe, in 50 years' time of how we do the develop, make, market, and sell piece. I think the basic science is going to, obviously going to evolve, but I do think there's going to be a big evolution in that sense, really based on this hugely accelerating ability to take huge pieces of data, buy down the type 2 error, yeah, and then to deal then with really what you're looking at and to generate new hypotheses. So thank you very much.
All right. Dr. Lee.
Thank you. I think yeah, please. I was looking at your faces while I was sitting in front. First of all, I'd like to compliment the organizers for doing such a good job. I can imagine how much hard work went behind the scenes. You're doing a great job. The second thing is, as I look at your faces, I'm thinking somehow today our paths cross. You came from whatever path you have, and you will go on to whatever future you're going to, and a lot of stories will happen then. It's really impossible to predict the future, I think. And who would have thought all the turbulence that could have occurred in the financial market recently, or the Spain would be what it is, or Greece would be what it is. So I really think that I'll start off with the present, because I think if you want to think about the future, you have to start from the present. And we have a saying in China that a picture is worth 1,000 words. So instead of blah, 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 I'm going to show you some slides to show you, never mind about the future gap, what is the present gap? And if you don't understand the present gap, we cannot deal with the future gap. This is a health clinic in Vanuatu. And the prevalence of chlamydia is 23%. And we actually implemented a rapid chlamydia test where the first thing we had to do is dilute the urine from men. And they didn't have distilled water. I ended up validating bottled water to use as a diluent. Next. I'm sorry, do I?
There's a point on the table.
Okay, sorry. So quite a difference from where we are today. Look at the surrounding. And this is what most of the world, much of the world is living on. Secondly, this is the dry blood spots to do DNA testing. In much of sub-Saharan Africa, they do it from the finger prick, they do it from the heel prick, and you can imagine the kids are crying and the fingers are retracting, and some of the people have much thicker skin and it's very hard to get through. And you can see just from taking these dry blood spot, it is very difficult to get the sample collection right. Never mind about the super science, whatever it is, just taking the right sample is such a challenge. You can say, why should they do DNA testing? It's very expensive. Why would they do that? Let me tell you why. First of all, let me show you just some pictures about DNA testing. This is what it takes in the research lab, in my lab. From sample prep to amplification of your target to detection. This was taken at Edinburgh Hospital. This is the automated machine. This is for sample preparation, because you can imagine people have been looking for this Malaysian plane, and somebody said, never mind about looking for a needle. I don't know where the haystack is. And this is looking for the needle in a haystack, and in a very complex sample to look for that one piece of DNA. So this is for sample extraction, and this is for detection. It must be in a different room. This is a real picture. I was walking in the corridor, and my postdoc was pushing this thing. I said, Paolo, what are you doing? He said, we just received 1,000 tests for chlamydia testing. This is what it takes, the paraphernalia that comes with it. But that white box is really the killer. It's a styrofoam box containing dry ice, and you have to ship the very expensive labile enzyme in this box. And I don't know how many of you have been to Africa. Okay, well, you can imagine it is very difficult to get something shipped in the cold chain, right? And I actually personally had to go to the beer company to say, they get dry ice, so can you sell me some dry ice? And so you would say, why do you do that? Well, let me go back to this first. There are two needs today. One is that the babies born from HIV-infected mothers are infected either in utero or during birth or during breastfeeding. In all of United Kingdom in the last decade, there was something like 1,000, not quite, babies infected by HIV, born from HIV-infected mothers. That's because we test the mother, we do prophylaxis, we do cesarean. In the developing world today, there are so many women who are infected by HIV that each year 350,000 babies are born infected. And the thing is, they are born with millions of virus. And if you don't test and treat them within the first few months, 50% of them die by the second birthday. So how do you test these babies? Well, you can't test them with a cheap antibody test because the mother is infected. So the mother is antibody positive, so the baby is antibody positive. You can't tell it. So the only way is to look at the presence of virus, hence RNA testing for the HIV virus. The second need is really for treatment monitoring. There are 40-some million infected individuals, HIV-infected individuals in Africa. And they're on treatment, some of them are, and you need to monitor whether they're resistant. If they're resistant, you need to switch. If they're not resistant, you leave it. In this country, we have first line, second line, third line, lots of drugs, lots of money. Over there, there's only 2 lines, 2 magic bullets. You switch it too early, you lost the second magic bullet. You don't switch early enough, you're resistant, then the resistance builds up not only in the individual, but also gets transmitted. So, therefore, I started out with that DBS, dry blood spot testing. What happens now today is that they send this dry blood spot into centralized lab because it's so complicated. In each country, there's only 1 or 2 labs that can do that. The dry blood spot get lost, the delay is there, so that even after this very complicated, expensive nucleic acid testing, this is the last to follow up after testing has taken place in different countries, from 37 to 87%. You may as well not have tested them. Therefore, the near patient testing, where the women are, where the babies are, is paramount. And I tell you one story. When the women come to clinics, and they don't have waiting room, often they come in the middle of the night walking with the children on the back, and I don't know where the men are, but anyhow, they show up, and so it's very difficult for the transport. So one of the doctor from Uganda who just came to see me said, I want to do something good. Let me give them 3 months of prescription rather than 1 month, so they can just take it home and then not have to come back. Well, at the time, the drug for the babies is still syrup, fairly heavy. So she told this woman, here's 3 months supply. And then she thought she did something wonderful. And then when she was still looking at the patient, she said, this woman is sitting there. So she went to her to say, but I already gave you 3 months prescription. She said, doctor, do I leave the baby here or do I leave the box of drugs here? She couldn't take both. Do you get what I mean? So this is a reality. I'm not trying to make a sob story because everyone is responsible for their own lives, and you probably save the babies from HIV, they probably die of diarrhea. Nevertheless, if we are to make any difference in whatever specialty that you have, we must, it's almost like I do diagnostic. This is my plate. I will do the best I can. I have to believe those to the left of me, to the right of me will do the right thing. So infectious diseases that is in the developing countries, I'll just show you this one here. This is the HIV subtype. It is the most mutating virus. Each color represents a particular subtype, okay? And you would think this happens in Africa, and indeed, there is one subtype called subtype B, which you see this orange in the right-hand side, just a tiny sliver in Africa today. Well, a lot of the diagnostics in the past have been focusing simply on B subtype because that is a subtype prevalent in the United States and in Europe. And that's where the money is. However, if today you go to a London hospital and you take all the HIV-infected individuals, you do the subtyping, I promise you they look exactly like that. Therefore, the drug resistance testing, the prevention, is not only critical for the people in the developing world, but it is also in our self-interest. It is coming either way. And for a woman who, let's say a stewardess in the airplane, if she had not been TB positive, if she is a stewardess, within 6 months, just flying in the plane, she is testing antibody positive to TB. Somewhere along the line, she was exposed. Yeah? So I'll just finish with one last bit, which is to show you it isn't about science only. It's about people when you try to implement something. And it is simple things. And I want to end up on a failure to show you what happened to us. I'm going to show you about the chlamydia. We developed the chlamydia rapid test with funding from Wellcome Trust, and we even had a neat little first void urine collector, which men are particularly coward, not very brave. You will not find a man giving you a urethra swab, yeah? And so you have to get a urine, and you can imagine that when you have infection in the urethra, you need to collect it. And it is clear that men cannot aim. If they aim, they cannot catch. And so to have this urine collector, so the first few ml goes neatly into the thing, and then you collect about 80%. In fact, I should tell you, when Wellcome Trust had the opening ceremony, Prince Philip came, and we showed it to him. And then in the end, when you finish doing this, you can put the tip upside down, just hold it, because you have to zip up. What he liked the most is this feature. So we've since called it the zip up feature. And so I want to end with a failure. We have this, I think, a neat little chlamydia rapid test. We tested 5,000 women in Philippines, where they have 10%, 28% in sex workers, They've never heard of chlamydia before. And then we thought, gosh, if so many of the sex workers are positive, the women must be positive. We went to another island to test in the OB-GYN, 10% are infected. And we also, I don't like this program called Embarrassing Body. It's pretty gross. Nevertheless, they asked us to go and provide the test. They tested young women young people on holiday in Malaga. And we set up the thing behind the bar. We tested them because the women just have to give a self-collected vaginal swab. The men give a urine. And of course, it's 7%, as you would expect. So chlamydia is a problem in the Pacific Islands, but it still remains a problem in this country because it's largely asymptomatic. Up to 50% of the women, up to 70% of infected men do not have symptoms. So it is still a problem even in this country. It is the same bacteria that causes trachoma, the pores of the poor, the one disease that causes blindness. We did it in the Maasai villages. This is the failure, and I finish here. We won an award, and we got $50,000 cash. And so I went to Samoa, where there are prevalence of chlamydia in the prenatal clinic was 38%. So I said, I'll give you the free test, provide for 2 years, provided you will treat the women with azithromycin. You can treat her with either azithromycin or with doxycycline. Azithromycin is 1 pill, 1 time, you're done, right? And doxycycline you have to take every day, and so the compliance isn't there. I went through to the DOH, I went to all this. I thought I got it completely done until the very end. The nurse, the head of the nurse, Samoa is very religious, and she absolutely refuses to let the nurses to participate. So it never got done and never got implemented. So I just want you to know that it is the pebbles that trip you, not necessarily the boulders. My previous speaker ended up with an advice. I'll give you an advice, which is I started with the Chinese image. Where we're going, we need absolutely transferable skill. There's no way to know what happens. So the only way for each of us to go forward is to collect the skill from others. And we have a Chinese saying, if you are a mountain stream, you make a lot of noise, thin water. You go to the river, it's a larger body. But when you go to the ocean, it is the greatest body. Why? Because it places itself below others. So I think we just need to collect all the wisdom from different people and be the ocean. Thank you.
Professor Dobson.
Thank you. Let me just say what a great pleasure and privilege it is to be here. I'd also like to compliment the organisers, the very youthful organisers, I have to say, for the really magnificent achievement of putting this meeting together. I can see them smiling at the back there. You did a fantastic job. So the whole of human history has been a battle against disease. As human societies, human activities have changed, new types of disease have always emerged, and often literally to plague the world. Perhaps following up some things Sharon said, it's a steadily increasing populations, increasing rates of travel have had huge impacts on the outbreak and spread of infectious diseases. In the 14th century, it took 7 years for the Black Death to spread from Asia to Europe. In the 15th, 16th century, it took 6 weeks for smallpox to travel from Europe to the Americas. In this century, it took 2 days for SARS to spread from a Hong Kong lift shaft to Chinatown in Toronto. These are huge changes. But the advances in the prevention and treatment of disease, from increasing hygiene to antibiotics and so on, have been really dramatic in changing this situation, although, as we know, this may not actually persist forever. But this decline in infectious disease, improvements in medical intervention have been so dramatic we live much longer. In Cambridge, for example, in 1863, the average lifespan was 35 years. Now it's over 80. Indeed, it's been estimated too that of everyone in human history who's ever reached the age of 65, more than half are alive on the planet today. So there are huge demographic changes. And the result is, of course, that other new diseases have begun to dominate our lives. These are notably, but not exclusively, neurodegenerative conditions such as Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. So I might add that type 2 diabetes, actually, we believe is caused by very much the same chemical phenomena. At the age of 65, you have less than 1 in 100 chance of Alzheimer's disease. At 85, it's about 1 in 3. And the financial cost of these diseases is astronomical. It's estimated in the US, for example, in 2010, that the cost of Alzheimer's disease was $270 billion in 1 year, from care of patients largely. It's predicted in 2050 that that cost in the US will pass the $1 trillion mark. In the next 40 years, the US will spend $20 trillion in the care of Alzheimer's patients. These are huge numbers, and they scale for much of the rest of the world. Of course, the social and emotional cost is even bigger, and it's incalculable for victims and families and friends. So these diseases really were virtually unknown 50 years ago, and have now emerged as being probably the group of diseases that is most feared in much of the world. So what causes these diseases is not an external agent of a bacterium or a virus. It's actually our own protein molecules. And under normal circumstances, our proteins, of course, enable and control everything that goes on in our bodies, from breathing to moving our muscles and nerve action to cognitive function, memory. But these diseases are associated with changes in our proteins where they aggregate or clump together to effectively precipitate in our cells and our bodies. They form deposits which are very familiar, for example, in the plaques of Alzheimer's disease. So why does this aggregation, this clumping happen? We have something like 100,000 different types of proteins in our bodies, and they're present in very, very high concentration in our cells. It's so that we can be biologically competitive. We can carry out chemical reactions very quickly. We can pass information very rapidly between systems, between cells. But it turns out we now know that protein molecules actually only exist at these high concentrations because of the presence of a large number of biological mechanisms that actively inhibit the aggregation and prevent them from precipitating. And these, if you like, housekeeping mechanisms scour our cells, and they pick up the beginnings of aberrant behavior as protein molecules misfold and start to come together, and then they target them for degradation. And this is how we avoid these types of condition for much of our lives, or certainly our traditional lifespans. But as we get older, the chances of this aggregation increase, at least in part because there's an increased probability of damage to our proteins in our cells, but it's more particularly because this protective mechanism starts to run out of energy and to fail. And we therefore lose control of the prevention of aggregation, perhaps in rather the same way that in cancer we lose control of cell cycles, cell proliferation. Moreover, once this control is lost, the rate of aggregation becomes more rapid. Its extent increases. It's rather like a catalytic chain reaction. And so the condition the situation gets worse. And this aggregation and precipitation doesn't just result in a loss of function of proteins, but actually generates states of proteins that are not functional, but they're toxic. And these aggregated proteins interact inappropriately with cell components and trigger cell death in the case of neurodegenerative diseases. These are neurons. In type 2 diabetes, in fact, they're islet cells in the pancreas. So it's really only in the last 15 years or so that we've begun to learn much about the fundamental molecular mechanisms of these processes, particularly, I might say, through the development of really highly interdisciplinary research in many places, bringing together physicists and chemists and mathematicians and clinicians to understand the phenomena. But the good news is the knowledge from these studies suggests that there are strategies whereby we can reduce the probability of this aberrant behavior from occurring and enable our protective systems to function for a longer time, maybe for a much longer time, by artificially reducing, if you like, the risk of this protein aggregation, reducing the toxicity in various ways, and perhaps enhancing our natural protective systems just to work better, rather perhaps as we can improve immune systems to help with treatment of cancer. So I'm really very optimistic that it'd be possible to develop fundamentally new types of therapy based on agents that will vary from small molecules to antibodies that will inhibit or make less likely these types of process. So I think there are huge opportunities for biotech companies in this area, provided, of course, they're willing and able to access the fundamental knowledge from innovative research programs. I believe these particular disorders are not an essential part of aging. They're diseases, they can be treated to give many more years of healthy old age to countless millions or billions of people. But to achieve these objectives, we'll need your leadership and certainly a lot of other people's money. But Alzheimer's alone costs our healthcare systems much more than cancer and heart disease combined. In the UK this year we'll spend about £25 billion on the care of Alzheimer patients. In research and prevention, the expenditure, in 2010, it's a bit higher now, was about £50 million. That's 1/500th of the cost of the disease itself, or 0.2%. This is tiny compared with money we spend on other aspects of our lives. I think Terry Pratchett pointed out that £50 million won't build a mile of motorway, and certainly wouldn't prevent the Somerset levels from flooding, which is clearly the great thing that people are worrying about in the news. And this cost is going up dramatically. It will at least treble by 2050. So to finish, your leadership's needed to get this message across, I think, to politicians and funders, and to start new companies, of course. Otherwise, you'll undoubtedly spend your middle age looking after the rest of us and definitely paying for our care with all your hard-earned income. These diseases aren't inevitable any more than the outbreaks of bubonic plague and cholera are inevitable, at least in my view. But as with these diseases, it's essential to recognize their cause through basic research, to translate that information into drugs through innovative biotech companies of the sort that I'm sure that you can establish and bring to flourishing. The alternative is, I think, unthinkable. But as we're starting to understand these diseases, one has to remember we're a couple of centuries or more behind understanding infectious diseases. and major breakthroughs took a long time, or take a long time to take in any disease. So you really got to get on with it quickly, certainly as far as I'm concerned. We need you to do so, and I believe that the sort of astonishing developments in science over the last 20, 30, 40 years give a huge armory through which you can attack these diseases. We should get on with it. I believe in human ability to conquer disease, and I think this is the next frontier we really have to take on board. So, thank you.
Andrin.
All right, last but not least, I would like to thank the organizer actually for inviting me, and I hope you will forgive me to use my few minutes for a sales pitch. Because I don't try to be comprehensive, but I would like to convince you that while you think about your future and careers, maybe to work in vaccines would not be a bad place to be. There's no doubt that vaccines are one of the most powerful, most successful healthcare technologies or public health technologies of the past. But sometimes they're seen as a bit old-fashioned, everything has been invented, what the heck left is there to do? So let me share with you a few thoughts on how vaccines can help us to address some of the trends and challenges that we see for the world and the healthcare systems to come. You've seen this morning a slide on demographic and population growth in the world. Now, I was very happy to see that after 2050, at some point in time, it starts to decline. Unfortunately, for me as an executive of a vaccines company, even having a very long-term view, by that time I will be retired. So my challenge is more, how are we going to address that huge demand increase over the years to come? It's a dramatic increase, and it's not just that we have more people, but also these more people having higher and higher affordability levels will require, rightfully, all their children to be vaccinated. How do you address that? Because it's also clear that the money available to do that is limited. And I was interested to see in the example of elasticity of supply and demand in oil. If you think in vaccines, it's interesting. While this demand goes up, you know what happens to our prices? They go down. Because it is seen as a public health right for most people to get vaccines. And for us as a company, while this demand goes up, we are asked to produce cheaper and cheaper. How do we do that? I think innovation can play a huge role there. One example that we're working on is RNA-based vaccines. If you use an RNA production technology, you can actually make millions of vaccines that in today's world, with today's production facilities, require a site that is probably half of the site of that campus. More or less, you could do the same thing in a room like this. Because RNA production, synthetic RNA production, is much more efficient, much more controllable, and hence you could do the same production and make the same vaccines available for a fraction of the price. Global warming. It will have a dramatic impact also on health and diseases around the world. Here is an example of how malaria, for example, is supposed to evolve. And those of you who are from the areas where there is malaria, you know the disease, of course, very well. For most of the people living in the northern hemisphere, you don't need to vaccinate against malaria. You don't even need to treat against it unless you go on a field trip and then you need some preventive medicine. I think when we look at the trends of global warming, these days will be gone someday soon. Malaria will come up north, dengue comes up north, West Nile is already up north. Many of the developing country diseases will, over time, become developed country diseases as well. There's one level to it which is even more intriguing. Microbiology in general. All of us have on their bodies and in their different body cavities billions of bacteria. Now, where you're grown or where you grew up on this planet fundamentally influences what you're populated with. So if you make a swap of somebody who comes from Canada and a swap with somebody who comes from, let's say, Brazil, looks very different. And there is mounting evidence that your flora, the flora of your body, has a dramatic impact on what type of diseases you develop. Autoimmune diseases, for example, that we sometimes don't know where the origin comes from. There are more and more correlations with this microbiological flora and the diseases that you have or will develop. This microbiological flora is going to shift. A lot of it depends on the climate that you live in. While the climate changes, the flora will change too, and the disease pattern will change. This is something that we will need to understand much better, and there needs to be much more research in it as well for us to be able to anticipate and develop the right vaccines for it. Aging, it had been discussed before. There is clearly something where there is no difference between the developed or the developing world. Aging population is going to increase everywhere. I do think that we can do much more with vaccine-based technologies to vaccinate the elderly. While in the past, vaccination was something for the children, I think in the future you will see vaccination as a technology that will make a big difference for the health for the elderly. Not just infectious diseases, but as it has been discussed, in cancer or even in diseases like Alzheimer or some other autoimmune-related diseases. And many events I go to, I do hear a lot about the aging population and how much is needed in the healthcare system and how much they need to change to address the growing need of the elderly. And I for sure do not want to start the generation war, but clearly, nevertheless, in vaccines, we do have a special passion and an interest in children and infants. And don't think that we're able today to protect and vaccinate against all the most deadly diseases out there for the young. And I think it has to stay a responsibility of society to make sure that the most vulnerable are and will remain protected despite the constant limitation and concern about growing healthcare costs. Let me give you one example from here in the UK, which is our meningococcal meningitis B vaccine. It took us over 20 years to develop from the time when the first genome of a meningitis B bacteria was decoded with Craig Venter in the 96, 98 timeframe, until finally we were able to make the first vaccine against what is a devastating deadly disease. On the left side, you see Amber, a 3.5-year-old girl from Liverpool, not that far from here, who was lucky enough to survive the disease and lost all 4 limbs. Every year in a country like in the UK, hundreds of children are affected, many die, and some who survive have a devastating life afterwards. When the vaccine was approved, first by the policy committee here in the UK, it got rejected because it was considered not cost effective. Now, the message I want to pass on here is, from my point of view, and I accept the fact that I'm biased and maybe have a certain self-interest as a business person, but above all, I'm a human being and a parent also. And I think it's important from my point of view that while we look at big trends and big numbers and millions and billions of people and what have you, let's not forget that healthcare, above all, is about protecting and the health of individuals, of one person after the other. And I would encourage you, while you grow and move on in your science careers or wherever life takes you, don't forget that. We tend to be absorbed by trends and by, I would say, either science or business that you're exposed to, and tend to lose track of the initial purpose of what we try to do. And I think it's important that we always remind ourselves. As far as I'm concerned, I see no reason why, even in a country where healthcare resources are limited and the disease is rare, we wouldn't do everything possible to have a child not to go through something like Amber did. Now, if I sum it up at the end, how do we combine it all? Increasing demand, limited resources, connected world, new diseases spreading rapidly if it's infections or viruses. So what would be a vision on how we can somehow try to address all of that in one single type of technology? So if I leave you with one vision for 2050, it would be, oops, one too much. Can you get me back to the last slide? Here is an idea where epidemiology, better understanding of diseases in different places around the world, genomics and a deep understanding of one human being and the risks that that human being faces, plus production technology and IT infrastructure would come together to deliver a completely different way by which you could look at vaccination. It's a simple patch that you can put on a baby. The patch would be tailored to the baby, so the vaccines you would find on that patch, meaning the antigens, would differ depending on where the baby lives and would differ depending on the genomic constitution of the baby and the risks that that baby faces. It is envisionable to have pretty much a small benchtop machine where this patch could be printed. When a baby is born, data is put in there. Genomic decoding is relatively easy to do, and the patch is printed according to the risk the baby has and hence the antigens that are needed to vaccinate that child on one patch. Much cheaper. You get rid of the 15 or sometimes 30 needle injections a baby needs. It is much safer because you would also be able to vaccinate few rather than a lot of babies who are more at risk for certain diseases. And of course, no doubt, it would give better protection to any baby around the world at a much more affordable price. This is not just high-level blah, blah. Now, for sure, it will take some time to get there, but we're working with Craig Venter and his institute to really make that happen. We're making good progress already with the first antigens we work on, for example, for flu, where we were able to make a vaccine more or less printed out of a computer within a very short period of time. And I think the vision to be able to do that in a fully integrated way for children vaccination in 40 years from now is absolutely alive. And I hope maybe some of you will join that adventure. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Andrin, and thank you to all our panelists for those great presentations. I hope you get a clear sense of this by now. There are no end of real health problems that need you to solve them. There are lots of really interesting new scientific advances and new technologies, whether in cancer immunology, in dealing with protein clusters or new vaccines that you can use. And as many of our speakers have said, you also then have to think about how these things are implemented and used in the real world, how the population is educated on their role in this, and you're also going to get to play with data, sort of big data, fun things like that. So, it's a pretty wide open playing field for you. Questions, fire away. Right. Why don't we start there and work our way back?
Thanks for sharing your views. I have a question about the change in patient involvement and how health is evolving with information access and all sorts of new tools. Do you think the gap is closing, or we have newer gaps opening, and how do we address those and perhaps leverage those in the coming future?
This is a huge shift that's going on. So the concept of, there's a couple of concepts here. One is this notion of patient-centric drug development. In fact, the FDA has just recently evolved that in its latest update to its regulations. So, thinking of the patient at the center and really understanding at the individual level how to redefine disease, both at the molecular, basic biological level, and then understanding the patient way beyond phenotype, what you can see. That's a huge thing that's going on at the moment. The second thing is understanding how patients feel about and navigate the healthcare systems that they live in is an enormous area. So, for example, in the old days, we used to say, if we can give a pill and drop the blood pressure, then of course the patients will want that and take it forevermore. Well, now we've discovered that they generally take it for about 200 days and then they stop. And it's interesting, patients actually stop their oral medications for cancer. They don't take insulin when they're diabetic. And it's because we really didn't understand the real unmet medical needs at a patient level. So really understanding the unmet needs in the eyes of a patient and what those needs are, and what influences them in their healthcare choices and behaviors and how that interacts with their therapeutics is hugely important. So one is redefining the patient. The second is thinking about how those patients think about their healthcare and how they travel through systems. And then the third thing is a huge evolution in how we select patients in the process of drug development. And Alzheimer's is such a good example. I worked on a gamma secretase program about 8-10 years ago. We just didn't know what we were doing. We didn't know how to define the patient population. It was a blunt instrument. We said Alzheimer's. We took the patients, we gave them a drug, and then we couldn't interpret the results. And we certainly didn't get a p-value that looked attractive. That's the way we did drug development. And I think that, therefore, applying this notion of a better understanding of the patients at a more molecular sort of level, biological level, really understanding the target product profiles that patients are going to value in the future and will want their healthcare systems to pay for. And then using those insights to design much more intellectual sort of programs that might look smaller and far more targeted is the future direction. So the patient at the center is one of the biggest trends that I've seen really in the last 10 years, and it's just going to accelerate moving forward. So I don't know if you agree with that.
I think that's true. I mean, I think the Alzheimer case has a number of very interesting features. My father died of cancer 40 years ago. Yeah. 40 years ago, the question was, did you tell him or not? Yeah. Because there was no hope. The same is true of Alzheimer's disease. So I think there is an issue of engaging the patient. I've given lectures in Alzheimer's disease where the organizer said, I'm sorry, the audience is so small because people don't want to know. And I think that's an issue. So I think there will be huge changes in attitudes towards particularly aging diseases when some drugs start to become effective, so there's hope. And I think that, with luck, that won't be so far away. I think the other thing about Alzheimer's disease in terms of drug discovery is there aren't good biomarkers. This is starting to develop. It's a huge problem for drug discovery. But there are some individual types of patients who are very interesting in this regard. I mean, there are people who will get Alzheimer's disease in their 50s. Most of those can be picked up by genetic markers. And so there are groups of people who really one should be targeting for drug discovery because that disease is not coupled up with other aspects of aging. It's really an early onset disease. And I think the more we understand about this, the better. But I think part of it is actually making patients want to discuss what they've got and actually to face up to it. And that will involve us providing some hope that we can do something about it.
Go ahead. Yeah, that's Joe, isn't it? Yeah. And then pass it on to the person next to you afterwards.
Sure. Hello. So sort of in response to hearing big data a few times, I just want to ask, what really are we doing with the value of information? Because, a lot of people are producing products and processes. So are there ways in which we can, we have a lot of information available from medical devices being connected to the cloud. How can we sort of bridge the gap in making use of that information? And sort of to follow on from that, I was just thinking that Tesco, for instance, the supermarket here in the UK, probably knows more about its customers than many healthcare systems know about their patients. And Google can predict flu epidemics faster than the CDC. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that and maybe how we can move forward with actually using information as perhaps our most valuable commodity in the healthcare space.
If you want to start, and then I'll pick up
I
on that.
think it's important to give the information to the patient, but to give the right information in the right way. I think you can just give too much information. And one practical example is that when they tested the pregnant women for HIV infection, there is a study where in the one case they show the women this fancy optical density stuff. A second one is just a simple dipstick, like a pregnancy test. 2 lines you're positive, 1 line you're negative, and you can see the line that's HIV positive. So the counselor will show the it was a control study, and show the women to say, you see, this is HIV. This is the line you're positive on. They can see it. And it turns out the group that looked at the dipstick came back 90-some%. They understood they're infected. They come back, took the drug, and brought the babies back. And quite different from the other group, which had all these fancy information. So I'm not against information, but is presenting the information in the right way to the patient that makes a difference and make them truly understand. Then I think you can really make a difference.
And if I just build on that, because I have a lot of these discussions with systems leaders. From your point of view, one of the things that I think you're going to have to deal with is this is going to happen, right? So there's just going to be more and more data out there. It's getting cheaper and cheaper to produce. It's essentially impossible to stop, right? So you are going to live and do your work in a world just awash with data. And you're all scientists, so you all know the difference between signal and noise. And you all know that if I give you enough data points, you'll find a correlation somewhere, right? And this is the danger, right? The good news here is that there's data here that you can actually use, because it is ridiculous that we give drugs to people and then have no idea what happens to them, and we need to fix that. On the other hand, all those other people out there who will read your palm and tell you your fortune will now propose to read your genome and tell you your fortune. Right? It's just going to happen. You're going to have to deal with that. From my point of view, concretely things that you can do about this. If you're really focused on coming up with new therapeutics, two things. One is help the healthcare system make sure that the right patient gets the right therapy. So use this data somehow. Find a companion diagnostic, figure out the right set of people, the right, the exact target group. Help the system make sure that whatever you come up with is only given to the people who are going to benefit from it. And then the second is, whatever you do with your technology, as much as possible, make it easy for people to figure out what's happening to the patient who's taking it. I mean, a ridiculous ancient example, if you treat people with tuberculosis, you'll end up at some point giving them rifampicin. This is a sort of old and rather painful antibiotic. It turns your urine orange. If you don't tell the patient this, by the way, when you give them that drug, it gets very messy. But it's actually kind of useful, right? Because you can then actually know if they've taken the drug or not, right? That's ridiculously primitive. You should be able to come up with much, much better ways of figuring out if someone is actually taking the treatment that you've developed and making it easy for the system to figure that out. That will make everyone's lives a lot easier. And that, for me, is the real value of these data and technology things that are coming out. And we'll find another way to deal with the charlatans.
I just want to make a point about that. I'm always struck by the use of words and how they have a gathering momentum. So in the 90s, it was all about strategy. And we've had this huge thing around innovation. And now we have this whole thing about big data, all right? So my view is that the industry is in a perfect storm when it comes to this topic at the moment, so that we swim in a sea of data with no insight, all right? And I think we have to keep in mind, and it goes back to my comment about statistics, all right? That data is only as good as your ability to turn it into information that generates knowledge and insight that then allows you to answer the question that you originally had in your mind. And that's why I like Bayesian statistics, because that takes us back to this, which is this notion of data doesn't replace the art of science and scientific inquiry. And so I have to tell you from my experience in large pharma R&D, everyone gets very, very excited about the fact they can now get access to a lot of data. And I used to spend all my time saying to people, tell me what the question is that you have on your mind, and tell me now how you're going to go and use the ability to go and prosecute data to start to generate hypotheses that are then testable in this virtuous cycle of scientific discovery. So I would say to you all, you're in this room because you have a love of science and wanting to advance options and healthcare options for patients on a global basis. Don't fall in love with the notion of big data. The other thing I would say to you, though, is the pharma industry has been notoriously slow in adopting modern technology and modern ways of thinking. So what you will see now is that the industry, I think, will go through this period of absolute storming, and at some point will land on a way to be able to use the insights at Google and Yahoo and Amazon and all these other things to be able to help us to accelerate innovation. It's absolutely not there today. And I do believe that in the next 20 to 30 years, you will have an opportunity to help us do that, because it is a bit of a perfect storm at the moment.
Let's work our way up there, gentlemen.
I was just going to add something briefly on that, which is that, I think if one's optimistic, I mean, the fact is that most medical discoveries have been based on incredibly small amounts of data. And, you look even at the... every time you look at the paper, there's another cure of Alzheimer's disease being tested on 10 patients or whatever. We're very good at handling data. Google's pretty good at handling data. And I'm very optimistic that, we'll find ways of actually doing much better ways of extracting information from that. And I think it will transform our activity.
Yeah, I agree.
Actually, yeah, so my question was building on that point. Essentially, do you think that the current approach to aging diseases is our approach to developing drugs and treatments in that respect? Say with something like Alzheimer's disease, a vaccination, how do we measure that? Are we asking the right question? Is it sufficient, the way in which we're approaching it? Because obviously it's different to infectious diseases where we treat it and hopefully it's gone. This is we treat it and we don't really know if they were going to get it in the first place.
Well, there's several points there. First is there are some people we know will get it. I mean, there are some people with genetic mutations. So, and actually 1 in 3 is a pretty high chance of getting it when you get to sort of 85. I mean, I think there are two aspects of your question, really. I mean, the first is that it's absolutely true. One of the key issues is to get some proper biomarkers for disease. And, companies in the past were trying phenomenological approaches without any real means of reading it out. And this is a big issue. But there are advances in that. I mean, there are major advances coming about. When you understand the nature of the processes, molecular processes, then you can actually try rationally to sort of identify them. I think the other thing is, as I sort of said, I mean, the underlying origins of these diseases are only just becoming understood. So everything that was done more than 10 years ago was probably based on inaccurate, at the very best, experimental data and screening of the wrong process. And so I think it's absolutely essential we work out the basic science. But now it's becoming clear from a lot of scientific research, it's these very early steps in the disease that you have to address. And there are ways, I think, I mean, that's what biology does. It stops it before it started. But I think the biomarker issue is absolutely crucial until we've really got proper readouts of the disease. Not, in my view, to predict who's going to get the disease, which I'm not sure is something I particularly would want to know, but actually it's so you can do proper drug trials, which at the moment are virtually impossible.
I think there is also a shift in drug development next to understanding the science better while you develop the drug to what you do once you introduce the drug into the real healthcare system. So what we call the phase 4, what happens in the period after the drug is actually approved, becomes more and more important. And I think companies think much more through where to launch a new medicine, in what type of setting, so that you can avoid some of the things that can go wrong in the first step. If you take a new vaccine, for example, where you have a big risk that signals are detected, which sometimes are noise rather than signals, and it can very quickly kill a new medicine, which otherwise would have been actually a very good medicine, because what is detected in the noise turns into the fact. So to some extent, the communication and the rapid availability of data becomes a threat to the real science because it runs faster than the science can. So I think we're more and more looking for healthcare systems that actually can work with us to have a vaccine introduced and properly monitored so that you really know its real value early on, in the best interest for finding out whether the drug really works or the vaccine really works or not. You can go to the US, to Kaiser Foundation, where you have very integrated, controlled healthcare systems, for example. Vaccination for the UK is great, where NHS does a great job, has a good system on how to do real-time pharmacovigilance, while a new vaccine is introduced. And I think that whole field for me is just at the beginning. I mean, there's much more work to do and much more collaboration needed between companies and healthcare systems to do it well.
I think that in 50 years' time, you will not have phase 1, 2, 3, 4. The whole of that will be different, and it will be exactly this, that you'll have this notion of accelerated approval, which we're already starting to see on the basis of phase 2, and then you'll have a lifelong series of learnings and opportunities to really use the patient population to think about what you're learning about the science as the drug gets out, and that this blending of phase 3 and 4 will just move on. And in 50 years' time, I hope that the regulatory science will have caught up, because that's the biggest bar to that at the moment.
Go upper left.
I hope you're right.
Can we get a microphone over to the gentleman? Oh, pick one.
Yeah, so following up to the previous question about drug development, there are many solutions available in the nature. For example, you mentioned about malaria. Tropical countries has natural plants which can treat malaria. Do you think that our whole fundamental approach for vaccine development should change to address the future health gap, like going back to the nature? Is that a solution?
Andrin, Dr. Lee, Dr. Peacock.
So your question is whether we should be thinking about new drugs for malaria. Is that right? Could you just clarify? Natural sources. Right. Okay. Right. Okay.
I think.
Right. Yes. Well, the best example of a recent anti-malarial drug is artemisinin, which was from a natural source and was used in China thousands of years ago to treat malaria. And so I think there's only one answer to your question about whether we should be looking at natural sources, and that is yes. I'm quite sure that there's a large resource there that still remains untapped, and in places that perhaps we haven't necessarily looked for, so deep in the sea and other places where we need to look at sort of biodiversity and what that can offer us. And so I don't think there's any way that we can ever become complacent and say we don't need to keep looking, because as I mentioned when I was talking, evolution means that things are always one step ahead of us, and we've seen resistance in malaria to all of the drugs that we have emerging in Southeast Asia. So there's always this tension and battle for us to find something new. So I think that pressure on us to look for new drugs, it remains as strong as ever, actually.
We've only got a few more minutes, so let's do some more rapid-fire questions, if that's okay with you. The gentleman over there who had his hand up last time, and then we'll come back down.
Hi, I'm from the US, and I'm not sure how things are over here, but in America, there are certain industries that are very tightly controlled for like security reasons, like tech and energy. And so I wanted to ask the panel, do you foresee any scenario where the delivery of drugs or diagnostics or vaccines will be encouraged or discouraged for political reasons between certain countries?
Well, yes, absolutely, yes.
It's already happened.
And for example, when we had the H7N9 pandemic that started in China in April this year, the Chinese authorities uploaded the gene sequence of that new virus on their website. We downloaded it, translated it back into a DNA, and made a vaccine out of it. As soon as we did it, we got accused by the Chinese government of having kind of, I wouldn't say stolen, but have used information from China, without properly informing them, or maybe at some point in time even paying a royalty. So I think as far as, at least in the pandemic area and where medical countermeasures are concerned, I mean, there is a big political element to it, and I don't think this is going to improve, but it's probably going to get worse in the years to come.
Remember, the delivery of healthcare is local. And people often forget that in our industry. We can do the best science in the world, we can do all sorts of wonderful things today, but at the end of the day, the interaction between the physician, the nurse, the patient happens at the local level, in the local clinic, yeah? And that national priorities and politics will continue to play a role. We just have to get used to it and be better at trying to navigate it, I think.
There was an FBI, I think that was done 2 or 3 years ago, an FBI agent who, testing the security of the US president, walked with a little flask like this through the whole security system into the president's office. And it could have been full of whatever you pick, Ebola or whatever deadly virus you want to use, which was a big wake-up call to the whole security system, and what is really done, to ensure national security or politician security against bio threats. And I think that agenda, from my point of view, will become more important and not less important, while the genomic technology becomes so widely available. And we're not that far from where all you need is a little lab and a computer, and you can more or less re-engineer your own virus.
One more question. Lady in the middle there.
Hi, my question is for Dr. Oswald. It seems as though fear plays a very large role both in preventing wider adoption of vaccines and also actually in spreading the use of vaccines based on the high mortality associated with some of these very severe conditions despite their relative infrequency. Do you think that fear has a place in the medical community in terms of driving the use of these products? And as a follow-up, do you think that wider spread use of diagnostics and availability of information will help to mitigate that fear by assigning a little bit more context around some of the probabilities associated with these conditions? Thanks.
Difficult question. Good question, but difficult to answer. I think, first of all, yes, fear is absolutely part of human nature, and to the extent that medical and healthcare systems are about human beings, fear is part of the system, as is hope. I think one doesn't go without the other. For vaccines adoption, for example, fear goes both ways. There is part of the society who has fear about the side effects of the vaccines, and those are the laggers and do not want to touch anything new. And then you have the others who have more fear about the disease and would want to adopt it quickly. So I think that is something that we will have to navigate and will continue to have to navigate in the future as well. It would, of course, be helpful if we could take some of the fear away so we can introduce a new technology more on facts rather than emotions. And to some extent, we would hope that better information would make that possible. But as discussed before, there is a challenge between us providing better information and the ability by which, in the global connected world with the social media, rumors and stories are spreading. So I think there is a combination of both that we need to do. On one side is to be better in proactive information and having better scientific support of a new vaccine. And also, I think we have to become better in engaging in social media and being able to control the stories that are out there, whether we like them or not.
I think one of the interesting examples, of course, was the MMR vaccine, where are based on little and flawed evidence. Millions of people in this country and elsewhere decided that they were too frightened to have their children vaccinated. I mean, this seems to be very strange because one knows the risk of the disease and an absolutely minuscule risk, even if it were true, of the side effects. And I guess it's because individuals make decisions and therefore feel responsible for something while pandemics come and it's not really their fault, it's God or somebody else who's caused it.
I think the role of the physician in the next 50 years, I'm very, very interested in this topic. The role of the physician traditionally being the learned intermediary between the patient and healthcare options. And today, the role of the patient in accessing, their healthcare information, now predominantly not from their physician in many countries, but on the web, because that's where patients now go. And then the role of governments who are trying to procure health for their populations. So you might sort of ask yourself, as you some of you are physicians, what will be the role of the physician and how will the physician moving forward in this new ecosystem find their position and value, certainly in what I would call the more sort of developed countries. I think that's going to be a fascinating trend that we're going to observe in the next 20 to 30 years.
Last question, lady there in the middle.
Hello, my question is for Dr. Lee. I do commend the work that you're doing, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. So you did mention that there are a few centralized laboratories across Africa that actually run nucleic acid-based testing for HIV. I think that's that's a big problem. So in your experience, I want to know if African governments, international organizations, and private companies are actually paying attention to this problem. And if they are they actually working or looking to improve infrastructural development and capacity building in the area of HIV detection and chlamydia?
Well, there are really two answers to your question. One is, what is a diagnostic companies or scientists doing? And we, like many other companies, are making near-patient nucleic acid-based testing. I didn't show it to you, but we have a heat-stable, simple test where everything is ready and you just plug it in and then use a cell phone to start it. And we actually are doing what is called task shifting to train the women in the villages to be able to do that. It is truly so simple. I always think anybody who can cook can do it, which leaves half of the men out here. But so they, not just us, but there are many companies doing the so-called near-patient testing, right? So that's one part. The second part to your question is, what does the government do? I can't say I understand the health structure in Africa, but I've been around for a few years and watching it. Two things come to mind. One is that there really isn't the money. So in the end, you have the Global Fund, the PEPFAR. The money is always top down. Okay, and because of corruption, the money doesn't go to the Department of Health. It goes to these non-governmental agencies who are themselves minnows around just to pick up whatever possibilities they have. So it's a very strange environment, and I don't know how it will go, because right now there's a lot of money still from Global Fund, but they keep trying to tell the government, you now need to pick it up. But don't forget, HIV is lifelong. You pick it, you have somebody diagnosed, you have to treat that person so it's cumulative treatment and all that. So in the end, what will happen in the 5 years' time when the Global Fund dries up, when the country themselves don't have the money, is a big shift of what will happen at that point. And my only hope is that the little experience I've had is I realize actually Africa is not just rich in minerals and diamonds. They are rich in human resources. It is the system that fails them. And so I'm hoping that more private enterprise will go there and unleash this capability within the country and possibly take some of the technology, produce it there, and actually export to the developed world. That's anyhow my dream. We're trying to identify places where we can do technology transfer.
So we're now well into your coffee break, so I would just like to thank you for your excellent questions and the great discussion, and thank the panelists for